What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 6 Cash Game Review, where myself, TJ Hernandez, your host and director of DFS at 444, and my co-host, Matt Savoca, go over our cash game lineups from the main slate from the day before. Before we get into it today, the DFS MVP Cash Game Review is brought to you by SuperDraft Fantasy, the official fantasy partner of Caesars Rewards. DFS MVP listeners get an instant $20 deposit match with their first deposit by using the promo code 444. That's the number 4, FR, the number 4 at registration. Get in now to play Super 15, a game where everybody has seen the memes, but nobody could play it until now. You'll recognize it as soon as you see it in the first time. You'll be able to play with money and to win money. Use the code 444 on SuperDraft app for your instant $20 deposit match. Try it for yourself. And anyone who deposits now, if you're a new SuperDraft user, you can get a free 4for4 hoodie. Go to 4for4.com/SuperDraft for details on that promo. Matt, how was your week 6, sir?
It was very good. We're clothing people with super draft offers.
Yeah,
This
man.
is great.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to take advantage of that. It was a great week 6 in
Yeah.
cash games. Finally back on the right track. And, I honestly have a tendency in these weeks where it goes pretty well, as it did this week, to just be like, well, I just listened to the projections and I followed the value. And then when I have bad weeks, I do the exact opposite. Well, here is why I made all these wrong decisions. I could have done this better. I could have done that better. But no, there was some solid decision making here. And as you'll see, this is absolutely an abnormal cash game lineup because it was altered a ton by late swap. And it was kind of a weird slate in that some of the chalkier players did a lot of their damage or gave a boost to their fantasy scores in that 3 o'clock Eastern hour. So in the time where I was sorting out my late swap, they were still scoring points and it got a little bit better. But as I started to look at my lineups, I really was headed towards a losing week. And I ended up turning it around with an 137.98. There's about 75th percentile or so, with 73% win rate in head-to-heads and double-ups. We can't complain there. The only thing I'm complaining about is that I was 0.8 shy of cashing in a couple of quintuple ups. And I'm seeing a comment here in our YouTube feed. Wish I'd played my 215-point team in a lot more contests. Eric V. I'm sorry, my man. You got to play the triple ups. You got to play the quintuple ups with your cash lineup for this exact reason. Doesn't have to be a ton, but it's for weeks like this where it kind of comes together real well.
Before we get into the actual review of the lineup, first, actually, let's just talk about that real quick. What do you usually do? I know we've kind of mentioned it on here. Like, what's your process for putting your cash game, giving your cash game some upside? Is it just the 3Xs and the 5Xs?
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm headed. And honestly, Eric, I've made this mistake before. If I don't have as much time on Sunday morning and I'm just dealing with head-to-heads or focusing my energy on GPPs, I kind of forget about this part of my process. But honestly, all I do is siphon off a small percentage of my GPP budget, and I bring it over to triple ups and quintuple ups. I don't change a thing about my cash lineup. You're kind of kidding yourself, though, if it is in your cash game budget, because it really is a tournament at that point. However, just play your cash lineup. Don't change a thing about it, because when it is the optimal, you got to get a good cash in.
Yeah. See, I actually do look at it as my cash game budget because when it does hit, like, I'm going to get paid for it, right? So even though in like a software, it's not going to show up as a cash game, I'm still thinking about it like when this lineup hits, I'm still making money because I built this lineup, right? So I just, in my spreadsheet, I group those games together. I group my games by lineup, not by contest. So, I mean, I guess if you look at like my ROI, you might say, well, that's not your true ROI in cash, but like it's still the lineup I'm using. I guess that doesn't matter. Like, we just care what the end number is, right? So yeah, the way I actually do it is I'll put 70% of my cash game goes to head to head. So if I have $100, $70 would go to head to heads, and then the other $30 I'm putting in between like one huge main single entry double up, and I'll put a 3x, 5x, a 10x, and then some super small like 100-man or something like that. So maybe again, if I have $100, maybe a bunch of $5 contests of that size. But yeah, make sure you're getting the make sure you're getting the upside. Before we get into the review, let's talk about your lineup. If we could get that lineup back up there, Sal. And before we get into what you swapped to, let's talk about where you were at originally. I'm assuming you were on Kareem Hunt and then a couple different plays.
You got it. You got it. So it was pretty similar. Obviously, it was a 3-player swap. Ultimately, Kareem Hunt would have been in the flex position, and then Jacoby Myers, who was popping in our breakout receiver model, and then CD Lamb. All right, gotcha. All right. That would have been even better of a day, and I'll get into it in just a minute. But ultimately, I really think the process was sound here. We'll get into why I switched to the players I switched to, but if you listen to our Friday show, we were not getting away from Lamar Jackson this week. So that was given. And I really debated Andrews versus Kelce all weekend long. I wrote that I wasn't getting any lower in salary than Andrews, and his value compared to salary this week was just so high. But ultimately, I thought if I am paying up for that onesie position, I should pay all the way up for Kelce in a great game spot. And I also tried to look at it from, okay, where's the evidence that Kelce does poorly? And I honestly couldn't find one other than the variance of football, the variance of the tight end position. So ultimately, I'm not upset about going there. And then I think that it was just such a great week to just figure out which of these chalk, low salary running backs worked in your lineup, then get to Devontae Adams. The Vikings were popping as one of our value defenses. From there, it was sort of straightforward, if you will. The late swap is where it got interesting. That 3 o'clock Eastern hour is where I felt like I was really prepared going into the 1 o'clock game, so I knew exactly what to do. Still some decision making I had to do, but it's funny how it ultimately in the scoring didn't matter, but the process was still sound. That's just the way it works sometimes because CD Lamb goes off like he does, but I think it was a solid base and a solid week overall.
Yeah, I think like with your build going into, obviously we know CD what he did, but I think he's probably like a thin-ish cash play, just given like that game and how Dallas has been using their receivers, even though they had like a good total. Points have been really spread out. So I think if you're doing like not so great and you think CD might have a little bit of ownership, it kind of makes sense to swap. And then so basically you just looked at Lamar and Kelce combining for like 26 or 27 points, and that's where you're like, I'm probably falling behind a little bit, right?
Yeah, and it honestly didn't look good. There was a couple of cash games that I saw, or some head-to-heads where I saw that basically all the PMR from my opponent was gone, in which case I was kind of looking at it like, this is probably a wash. I knew at that point. But if I saw that they had one flex remaining, I just kind of assumed that was Kareem Hunt. And if they had 2, I knew that I had to late swap, essentially, because I needed to move off the chalk. And so I think we should get into it here. Ultimately, and we can get into this as whether this was a hit or a miss, but my big decision point early Sunday was that this was a lineup that could have fit Jonathan Taylor. And then there was all this negative news, as much negative press about a chalk RB1 overall that you could really imagine with Kareem Hunt, with the coach saying, quote, I don't want to kill Kareem. And I mean, especially with the fact that he may now head to IR. Injuries happen in the NFL, but still, there was concern heading in a way that we don't even have for other bell cow running backs. We can all admit that. And so this lineup could have easily pivoted from Kareem Hunt to Jonathan Taylor, and I loved Jonathan Taylor heading into the weekend. The ultimate decision to use Hunt was because multiple projection sources were saying that Kareem Hunt was the better value play there, and ultimately I just went with the numbers. So I'm not upset about going there. But then it also gave me more optionality in the afternoon if something like a poor 1 p.m. slate was going to happen. So I had 3 players to work with. And I actually want to do a little side tangent here about what I do to create my late swap options. I create just a short set of rankings, usually about 10 players that I call my slate breaker ranks. And we've talked about our late swap strategy before, so I won't go fully into it. But essentially, I create about 10 players who are usually not as chalky as certain others that have the ability to break the slate. 2 touchdowns, 100 yards plus. and not many people would be on them, whether there are obvious pivots at their salary that were more popular, or they're just low probability plays that could still happen. And so Hopkins was by far my number one player to pivot to in this case, with Lamb being second. And then we got sort of another tier where Cortland Sutton, Odell Beckham, and Amari Cooper fell into that next tier for me. So I felt like if I could get 3 of those players, I could have a shot at the 60 or so points that I really felt I needed to have the week I wanted to overall. So it ended up with a final 2v2 with Hopkins slated in there of Javonte Williams and CeeDee Lamb, or Odell Beckham and Cortland Sutton. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate decision to use Odell Beckham and Cortland Sutton was very simple. If Beckham hits his ceiling, it probably takes away from Kareem Hunt hitting his ceiling. The likelihood of them both hitting their high value score is lower. So as leverage, if you heard our last Friday show, off of the chalk, I used Odell Beckham and went with Cortland Sutton, who I would have rather used CeeDee Lamb, who was in my original lineup, but it all fit, all wide receivers. And ultimately, it's funny how it works like this sometimes, but the original trio of Hunt, Myers, and CeeDee score 49.8 points. The Hopkins, Javonte Williams, CeeDee Lamb would have been the best one, 58.9. And the one I switched to was 48.8. So essentially the same exact thing if I had just kept it. But again, I'm proud that I had that process set up prior to the 1 p.m. games, so I could just get that going easily once I knew I needed to invoke that strategy.
Did you have any players in your pool that didn't make it just because of fit? Like the ones I'm thinking about the most are RSJ and Mark Andrews, because they were pretty popular. Did you have any thoughts about them at all? And then I think probably you made the switch obviously from Hunt, but I think it's a good point to note that always the latest, most expensive player in your flex, you were like locked into 3 running backs before your pivots, no matter what, right?
Yeah, just because there were so many salary savers under 7K on FanDuel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. With Ricky Seals-Jones, I saw it as a situation where I didn't mind playing him in cash, but I didn't have to, especially with how good of a value Mark Andrews looked like. If I wanted to, quote unquote, go down in salary, I didn't feel like I needed to get past Andrews. And especially because I wasn't on a lot of the other Chiefs Washington players for my cash game lineups, and I wasn't going to be playing RSJ in a game environment play of any kind, I didn't really love it, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't know how many people used RSJ in like the big double up on FanDuel, but I don't think it, with the running back values, I don't think it was necessary to go to RSJ on FanDuel. Obviously, it was a really good play on DraftKings, but in cash at least. So I don't think you need to go down to that spot there. Like, he was fine. It's still a good play. You probably get up to, it probably gets you to cup or something like that on FanDuel. But like going back before the late swap build, was there anything that you saw in projections or after the fact that could have obviously ended up being very good with the late swaps, and it worked out, and the chalk didn't really hit too hard anywhere really, but anything that you would have liked to get to that you didn't in this lineup?
Yeah, my hunch that Jonathan Taylor was a better overall play than Kareem Hunt was right on, and I had that in my notes. I had it in this exact lineup, and ultimately I'm not going to beat myself up for something that was truly a coin toss, but seeing it, having that gut feeling, and then not going with it, that's tough. That's tough to stomach, and that's maybe something that I can improve, just sort of listening to my gut in that situation where the numbers are pretty darn close. And kind of listening to my own take about the Cowboys pass catchers, just playing that game. I know Amari Cooper disappointed, but Dalton Schultz was a great option. CeeDee Lamb, obviously great. Dak Prescott, great. And that's how we ended our strategy conversation. That was really the last thing I said on our Friday show. So just listening to myself there. There were some obvious other spots that I feel like should have been a little bit higher on my list, like the smash plays from a smash spot in Giants-Rams, where Henderson and Kupp go nuclear. Even Woods had a touchdown there. Those are pretty obvious plays, to be honest. And I'll add, it looks like cornerback James Bradbury for the Giants is getting roasted by wide receivers. Normally considered top 10, top 15 cornerback is especially these high agility receivers like McLaurin and Kupp. They're just toasting the secondary of the Giants right now. There's a couple other things like the Colts and the Rams D, but ultimately I think that this was a sound process and we got to the right games and ultimately pretty good on the right players.
The one value running back you didn't talk about, I know you wrote him up, but did you have any way you were getting Booker in over Williams or Herbert, like in that lower range?
Probably not. I felt like we saw Booker hit his ceiling in that game against Dallas with Mike Glennon, and he didn't have this sort of have to have it score. And now we don't need a huge value from him in cash games, but I just felt like Khalil Herbert, honestly, I hate to say it, but it was because of how he looked on film. Just there were guaranteed touches, and I thought he looked like the best running back that the Bears had in that game without David Montgomery. And then Darrell Williams, I wasn't moving away from, no question about it. So when you have Hunt at the top and then Williams, no real need to go up to Booker.
Yep. Again, obviously your lineup did very good, profited a lot. Anything in lineups above you that you noticed that were pretty apparent in a lot of lineups that finished near the top? Lineups that might have swept heads.
Yeah, Patrick Mahomes obviously having a lot of Kupp and Henderson, fading Devontae Adams, 5 targets. Come on, man. And then Joe Mixon.
Were there a ton of Mahomes lineups in your cash, in your double ups?
So I went into the big double up, and what I like to do these days is obviously there are a few scores at the very top, these outlier scores, and often, as you've said before, they're not very good cash lineups sometimes. So I usually go to the very top tier when they all start to stack right on top of each other. And I think this was an 170-point score, the next one 169.9. You get what I'm saying there.
Yeah.
They did have Mahomes in the upper end lineups, a lot of Mixon Henderson lineups that did very well. And that was something that I wasn't creating lineups that way just because the lower salary value was so high. But that's what I was really seeing there. And obviously, if you went to Andrews over Kelsey, it was better. No offense too.
It was easier to get to. It's always going to be a little bit easier, but like salaries on FanDuel, getting Mahomes in cash wasn't egregious on DraftKings. As great as he is as a standalone play, it's just almost always tough to justify Mahomes in cash. Any last thoughts on FanDuel this week?
No, I think that's it. We talked about all the main inflection points.
This week, and again, when we're moving over to DraftKings now, a lot of the talking points are very similar. I didn't have any late swap here. You see the icicles next to Hunt and Jackson, but they were two of the most popular plays on the slate. So I still ended up with a good day myself, 68th percentile in the big single entry double up, the $100 double up. My process was, well, even before we had the Hunt news, I was pretty locked into Lamar because he was so mispriced. Getting the blow-up game on Monday night, I think he probably should have been like basically priced at Mahomes level if we get that game before salary comes out. And then I was pretty locked into my mid-salary running backs here. We had obviously Hunt came late, but then we had Swift, Jonathan Taylor, Darrell Henderson, Mixon. Like I didn't see. I didn't really have any builds where I was getting away from that, even with Khalil Herbert, and I'll get to that in a moment. But obviously the big play, and with that, it was just a very obvious 3 running back build to me on DraftKings. Like on FanDuel, I think it's almost always going to lean towards running back. I think you had a couple weeks ago where wide receiver worked. On DraftKings, it's been a lot more of a coin flip situation this year. But this one, I never even really thought about anything but a running back in the flex. On the Hunt thing, I kind of like late night on Twitter on Saturday brought up the fact that no one was talking about his questionable tag. And I mean, say what you a lot of people had a lot of takes on it. I think a lot of people's reason to ignore it is because they already decided he was a good play and just didn't want to. And they were justifying it with things like, oh, well, it should be probable because if they had the probable tag, that would be it. When the news came out, when that statement came out, like you said, what was it that he basically said he doesn't want to kill Hunt, and that they were going to use the other running backs. The way I was looking at it from a standalone play, it's not like Hunt was this free square. He was priced in this tier with all these other running backs I just talked about. He wasn't a huge favorite. He wasn't playing a horrible run defense. And there's no guarantee. And when you look at his splits from last year, they had some weird games, but like their overall running back usage went down with Hunt, with Chubb out last year. So as a standalone play, I didn't even think Hunt was that good of a play because he had so many players priced around him that were basically in similar or better spots. With all that said, I think you have to play Hunt in double ups because I knew he was going to be in virtually every lineup. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. If he busts, you don't lose anything. If he goes off like everybody's saying he is and you don't have him, now you're trailing the field. With Lamar at 54% and Hunt in 74%, and in the late window, if things really go bad early, I could swap off him like you did. My teams were doing fine. And then if he smashes, like you don't even really gain that much on the field. So it was just a straight field play I didn't like the play. I thought he was the worst play of the bunch, but you still play him because he's going to be where I thought he would be. 75%. Any thoughts before I get on Hunt in general and just that weird running back situation before I get to what I could have changed?
Do you think there's any synergy when you use two players that turn into a pop star if you use their last names like Taylor Swift? I think that's possible there. No,
if I would have noticed that, I wouldn't have played it because I actually hate the Swift play in retrospect.
Yeah. Oh man, I like it, but I hear you, and I especially after you had that day from Taylor in the early window, you're not moving off Hunt. You just aren't. There's no need to get away from the chalk at that point. You just see where the chips fall at that point.
Yeah, and I had the benefit of seeing that Lamar was already 54%. So like I knew he would be really popular. I wasn't sure how popular, but then when I see him over 50%, I'm not even really sweating his game that much anymore because I just figure a lot of people are just falling into this build or a similar build. So on to those were my like kind of locks, my big decision points. And actually I got my decision points wrong and still kind of just got bailed out because the chalk didn't really hit anywhere. I was never really on Khalil Herbert because one, I didn't think he was going to be as popular as he was. He was 55% of double ups. And this is another, like when we're reviewing DK versus FanDuel really makes it a pain in the ass to be able to review these things. You have to basically click on every single lineup to see ownership percentages. On DraftKings, you could just download the CSV. So if you're watching, you're like, how come Matt doesn't talk about the ownership percentage on his? Because it's really hard to get them. And FanDuel doesn't make it easy. On DraftKings, you can just download the CSV and get them. But with the reason I didn't feel like I needed to play Herbert and I could stick to this $6,000 group is because, one, I just thought the $6,000 group had a tremendous floor and tremendous ceiling, and they were all underpriced already. And I thought that Darrell Williams and Herbert were going to be closer in ownership. So I thought it might be like 20-30 or something like that. It ended up being 55-12 in favor of Herbert being more popular. So my thinking was like, if these guys kind of cannibalize each other's cash game ownership, if they're just okay, I'm not like losing much on my build by going with my 6,000 build. Now, in retrospect,
go ahead. Do you remember what the difference was between Williams and Herbert in salary on DraftKings?
I think it was like $100. I think
that. Wow.
Yeah, or maybe it was 300. I think Williams was 49, and I think Herbert was either 46 or 48. I don't have it in front of me, but it was so close that I just thought people might just split the difference here, just because Williams was a big favorite, and I think there was like enough like CH hate going on that they were like, oh, finally this offense can use their running back. I was wrong on that take, and it didn't kill me. But if I knew Khalil was going to be that much more popular, I'd probably get to a Khalil build. Now that leads me to my next point. Another one of my decision points was, do I play RSJ or Kelsey? Like Andrews, I loved him. He was my favorite standalone play. His salary was just kind of weird. Herbert's 4,600, Williams was 4,900. Yes, so really close, like I said. So I was a little surprised by that, but RSJ and Kelsey was my other big decision. When it came down to it, Kelsey was the cheapest he'd been since November of last year. So I was just like, with Tyreek being hurt, I thought it was just too good of a spot to pass up. And that's really what it came down to. And I actually liked Darrell Henderson over DeAndre Swift. The lineup generator is one of the few times the projection was wrong, and I was right. Usually it's flipped. So I don't know if I necessarily, I think probably, I don't know, 8 out of 10 times when I'm in disagreement with the lineup generator is usually right. I'm usually wrong. So this time it didn't work. I think those are just the really only two things that I could have swung. The RSJ and the Khalil. And then that probably, if I probably stay on Kelsey either way, but Khalil might get me to Cup, and then my lineup's like 90th percentile or something, and then I win more head-to-heads. But I think if I change anything, I should have put more weight on getting Rams. So I already said I loved Henderson. Cup was never really fitting into my builds, but I was so hell-bent on getting to that game flow in GPPs. For some reason, I just didn't even really think about that in cash games. Like in retrospect, I should have just prioritized one of the Rams, and then I think that might get me to, like, obviously Henderson over Swift. At the very least, it might get me to a Khalil Cup build. But overall, pretty good week. And that was those lineups that just crushed. They were basically Herbert Cup lineups.
Right. Well, I guess really what it comes down to, especially with Herbert and the Williams pricing being different, is people really could use the extra 300 in salary this week. I mean, your wide receivers were fine, but they don't feel fine. You're talking about a fairly inept offense in Chicago, and then a team that's usually getting wiped out in the Texans. And now if we look at underlying usage metrics and some of the stats that we're always talking about at 4 for 4, then you know that it's a less thin or slightly less than play than it would feel like when you're talking about it. But you know, Mecole Hardman he would definitely be considered a role player on one of the best offenses in football. And so people really found usage for that 300, which is why you get that huge difference in popularity.
Yeah, and I think one of my blind spots is we talk about, especially on DraftKings, obvious builds. And I think I see that too much and don't take into account that, the field just isn't always going to agree with that. And things like that can really juice up a ownership percentage like Herbert, where I thought I was just like, I'd rather just pay down at like these wide receivers that I don't love, like Mooney and Hardman or whatever, but I can get 3 running backs that just have crazy break the slate ceilings, and there's a chance that like that's a 3 running back week where those 3 guys you 3 running backs can combine for 100 points with all of those options. And some people probably got pretty close if they played, if they had like a Taylor Henderson Khalil build. Looking at the week as a whole, moving past the actual cash game review and just looking at the weekly review, NFL, DFS, fantasy, whatever it might be, anything stand out to you this week?
I mean, it has to be the Cardinals, right? Just absolutely crushing against the team. I believe the Browns were favored in that game. Shouldn't have been that way.
Yeah,
what can we say? Hopkins finally goes off. That offense is legit and has Zach Ertz coming in. Wow.
Yeah.
Happy for the Jaguars. I was hoping that they could get to that 26 loss category. The Dolphins didn't look bad, but I don't know, man. Especially without that first round pick, that's a franchise I'm super concerned about. That offensive line is a problem.
Yeah, I was going to say
the last thing to say is the Giants.
Oh, what about them?
They are barely an NFL football team right now. And Kadarius Toney left after the first drive and was their leading receiver into the third quarter.
Yeah, I was very surprised by, and I touched on this, how much everybody overlooked Hunt's downside. We had so many running backs. It was just crazy to me that he was he had so many running backs priced similarly to him, and he got that much ownership. Like even in large field stuff, small field stuff, high stake stuff, like 300 and 500 buy-ins on DraftKings single entry tournaments, he was still like 50%. And I thought for sure some of the sharps would look at the Hendersons and the Taylors, and it might drive it down a little bit. That wasn't the case. I can't believe the Ravens love running backs that are 40 years old. That was interesting, and luckily it wasn't all Latavius, because I told Twitter I was quitting if he was the answer yesterday.
Isn't Devonta Freeman worse? Isn't that almost worse than all three?
Well, I couldn't. That was crazy. And I think, again, luckily, no Lamar and GPPs, Lamar chalk and double up, so I didn't have to sweat it too much. I was really surprised at Keenan Allen's production. They had garbage time. Mike Williams was questionable going into the game, and then got hurt for a second, like in the second quarter, and Allen still just kind of has a ho-hum game. So that was really surprising to me. Everything set up for him to have a big game there, and he didn't, even though they were getting smoked. And then we had hints that the Colts were going to have some explosive upside. If you go way back to like June, they were a team that had like really weird odds to be one of the highest scoring team. Like they were top 10 in odds to be the highest scoring team in the league. When look ahead lines came out, they had some of the highest implied totals and over unders. And then after Carson Wentz got hurt, everybody kind of stopped talking about it. So like Carson Wentz kind of, he can be decent and serviceable, but there were hints that this offense could be really good if we go way back before that preseason injury. There were some sharps talking about that, so it shouldn't be a huge surprise that they're flashing a little bit now, especially Jonathan Taylor. And then Ty gets hurt, but I mean that offense could they might be sneaky for a couple more weeks. That probably in GPPs they might be a team to be thinking about. Anything that you want to talk about process-wise that you saw this week? Again, every week this segment should get a little bit shorter because we should be getting better at our process every week. But anything that stood out to you this week?
Yeah, the big takeaway for anyone listening / watching is I really suggest thinking through those slate breaker rankings for your late swap in the second half of games, because just having that list of say 7-8 players right off the bat, let me have a beer or two and know exactly what I was going to do when the 3:00 hour hit, and I knew I needed to late swap. It was a very easy decision point. One group of two or the other. That was it. Press go on all the lineups. We're done.
Yeah, my thing, and I've already talked about this, but this time it was a process that we fixed a couple weeks ago when Kupp was mega chalk and I wasn't on him. I brought up the point that when players are going to be that popular in cash games, especially if you're playing primarily double ups or 50-50s, it just makes sense to lean into those players, especially when we have like marginal point projections. We're bad at projecting players. We're really good at projecting ownership. So if that's going to be the case, even though we think we could be right, there's a lot of error in our player projections. So with players like Hunt, with players like Lamar Jackson this week, I'm just going to take those hits every single week. And we saw it in my lineup. Like you can have those icicles next to their names, and if your process is sound and the field just keeps doing that, you're going to be fine. Now, if you're playing primarily head-to-heads, you could make the case that like in those lineups, like maybe you go away from it a little bit, because the way to sweep head-to-heads is to not be exactly like the field. But in our double ups, in our 50-50s, I think it's just fine just to, even if you have a little bit of a read, when it's that overwhelming that the field's going to be on it, just take the hit. Thanks guys for watching. Again, I think this is a really a show that has a lot of hidden value. Like we don't see the players in our lineups like we do when we give away our favorite values, but our process is getting better, and you see it. Our results are improving every week, and I think we're kind of rolling now. So thanks for checking it out. If you're watching this, please give us a like on the YouTube channel and follow the 4for4 channel. Make sure you're checking out our other DFS MVP shows every Friday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern time. Myself and Matt are giving out our favorite value plays of the week. Every Saturday, myself and Matt Harmon from Yahoo give out our favorite Yahoo DFS plays. That's on the DFS MVP feed and the Yahoo podcast feed. Every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, GPP Last Look with Jordan Vanek. Make sure you're a 4for4 DFS subscriber to get access to that. It's in our Discord channel. You can sign up for the Discord channel right below this video. Make sure you're following us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you guys on Friday.